everybody. Welcome to a very special edition of Mainframe Comic-Con. Joining us today is a man whose name is synonymous with comic books. He has won awards with books such as American Flagg, continues to challenge audiences with his comics. Today we're going to be asking him just a little bit about his process, what makes a good-looking comic, as well as discussing some of his upcoming fan events, his meet and greet opportunities. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the great Mr. Howard Chaykin. Howard, are you there?
I'm here. Hey, Chuck. Thanks. You're too kind and grossly dishonest in describing my value, but I'm okay with this. I'm willing to mistake attention for affection.
So I want to, throughout the course of this talk, I want to do a deep dive in sort of your creative process, some tips, some things to do, things not to do for aspiring comic book creators. But I want to talk for just a second about your talent talk. You've got a fan meet and greet opportunity coming up next week, Tuesday, January 12th.
Yes, on Tuesday.
Yeah, over at talenttalklive.com. Can you give our viewers and some of your fans kind of a broad idea of the kind of material fans can expect from one of your Talent Talk sessions?
Well, what we're going to be talking about next Tuesday is the sort of the pivot, the nexus of what we're going to be doing. I've just come up with a version that precedes it, which will be a lead up to it. But what we're talking about is the page as paradigm, the comic book page, the page as real estate, the page as microcosm of narrative, and the panel as microcosm of the page. One of the things that I've come to realize it makes my head explode to say this, the 5 decades of my career, is that I became a writer out of self-defense, mostly because, for the most part, an enormous number of the writers with whom I was working in the earliest days of my career had very little idea of the actual real estate of the page, and it remains true today. So much of my job when I take a job when I'm working with another writer is translating what is basically a literary idea into a visual idea. And it has to be understood that from an artist's perspective, the writing of comics is a 50-50 job. It's the job of the writer to deliver the material, but it's the job of the artist to take that material and translate it into a visual form that is both narratively clear and beautiful, which is a subjective idea. Of course, beauty is subjective. But I'm a great believer in balance, not in symmetry. And much of what I discuss visually and textually in the paradigm thing, which we'll be doing on Tuesday, is the 5-panel breakdown of the archetypal comic book page. We talk about the placement of shape, why a panel is this shape, what a shape means in context, what the space between the panel borders mean, why you need space between panel borders, things of that nature. And also we discuss the page from a cultural perspective. We as a Western culture and how we operate in terms of threes, how we relate to how the reading from left to right has an impact on how we identify motion and action, and the relationship of space to time in the context of a comic book page. My first fear when I did the first one, this will be the 3rd or 4th time I do this week for Talent Talk, was that I'd run out of time in 15 minutes. But I found that the deeper I got into it, the more I talked about it, the more I felt there was more to discuss about the whys and wherefores of the size, shape, and placement of the panel. I'm one of those people who utterly and out of hand rejects the idea of comic book storytelling being based on an eyeline material. And in a technical sense, from an artist's perspective, that is what we call bullshit. Rather, it is a matter of the choice of deep space from one panel to the other that tells the story, that supports the narrative, that builds the page. And that's sort of the underpinning and the archetype of what's happening in the Paradigm 1, which will be happening next Tuesday.
So what are some of the major do's and don'ts in your opinion? I don't want to give away too much about the Paradigm because it is a very long, hour-long presentation that you do over at Talent Talk. But what are some of the major do's and don'ts that pop out in your head for aspiring artists, people when they're approaching a page? What in your 50-plus years of doing this, you think are some of the major mistakes that people make and advice you could give?
Give up the idea of throwaway panels. There just doesn't exist. I mean, every shape you put inside a panel has to have a reason why it's placed in that shape, inside that frame. The panel itself has the shape and size you choose subliminally tells the reader its value. If you do a page of 5 panels and they're all different sizes, you might very well take the risk of confusing the reader as to what he should be most paying attention to. I've said it more than once that there are 6 people involved in a comic book page. There's a writer, there's an artist, there's a letterer, there's a colorist, there's an editor, and there's the reader. The reader is the engine that turns the page. One of the reasons we paginate material, one of the reasons we control what the reader sees when we want him to see it, is that the reader is that engine. The turning of the page is a participation in the material. And the origins of this discussion was at the Marvel seminars I did in between 2008 and 2012. And the idea of understanding that there was no such thing as an arbitrary panel, that placement of figures in space had narrative value, that narrative value is a subjective idea, but it's based on motif, on focus, on concentration, on shape. Comics are a particularly static, non-plastic medium. They're not kinetic, they don't move. But anecdotally, about a year or so ago, a friend of mine posted on Facebook a series of shots from Hitchcock films, and pointing out that nobody frames shots like that anymore. And I said, I do all the time. You know, Chuck and I were talking before we started talking about here about the film and television influences. And I said, let's not talk about that, but here we are talking about it. The truth is that comic books are the perfect place to exercise what used to be done with rack focus. Any of you who've seen the recent film about Herman Mankiewicz, Mank, David Fincher uses a lot of the technique that Wells, through Greg Toland, used in Citizen Kane. And so much of that technique became both influential on comic book talent, and in turn influenced artists and filmmakers from comics themselves. That deep focus. And since comics have no sense of movement, the implication of movement is valid. And I'm not talking about speed lines. I'm not talking about multiple figures of the Flash or Johnny Quick running across a page. I'm talking about the placement of figures in space has a direct relationship to the narrative. And that every single element of the page, the color, the lettering, the panel borders, everything, the text, is part of the graphic experience. And it has to be addressed in that way. The writer has to understand that lettering is not simply a delivery system for text, but is part of the graphic experience. I've said more than once, the comic book artists are not illustrators. Rather, we are graphic designers in the service of narrative. And I'm a cartoonist, which means to me that I write and draw my own stuff. I mean, right now, I'm working on a job with another writer, which is something I promised myself I'd never do, but we break promises all the time because we're old and we don't really care. The promises are arbitrary and pointless. But one of the things that's happening here is that I'm refiguring and rejiggering some of his takes on material, mostly because it's in the service of that beauty I mentioned earlier. That frequently a writer will give you a series of images on a page which, had you followed his direction exactly, would feel like the visual version of dangling a participle. And rather than do that, I prefer to create an organized pattern of panels which have distinct and specific sized relationships to each other that create a sense of balance and organization. Does that make sense? I hope so.
It makes perfect sense. And I want to just kind of double down a little bit on what you just said, because you talked a little bit earlier, and I've heard you talk before about the flow of time in the comic book page. I mean, how shapes and distance and movement can kind of help the flow of time in a comic. Can you kind of expand on that just a little bit? What are some good ways that artists can help sort of the flow of time on a flat page like a comic book?
You're asking me to give away too much what's happening in the paradigm, pal.
No.
You're invested in me keeping these secrets, pal.
Just give me one. What's a good one?
Well, just anecdotally, I mean, as a culture, as a Western culture which reads from left to right, if you take a horizontal shape, a landscape image, the left side of the image is home. The right side is the world. Therefore, if you are creating a character who is out on that heroic quest, whatever that quest is, just going to the bathroom, moving from left to right seems to me the most viable and logical way to do it, which means placing a figure in that horizontal space as close to the right edge, the eastern edge of the image, that as you possibly can. That implies that the space between that figure and the panel border on the left has been moved through and transgressed. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Makes perfect sense.
Okay. The rest is a secret. You'll have to show up.
You got to check it out. Check it out on Tuesday, because there will be visual aids and all kinds of stuff to look at on Tuesday for your talent talk.
Comics is a visual medium, and it's important to note that we're not talking about drawing here. You know, I had someone when I posted the come on down and do this thing on Facebook this morning. Someone asked me whether it's for professionals or enthusiasts, and I said both, because basically, I'm a great believer in being able to deep read. I mean, we all start as comic book enthusiasts because of the material, because of the subject matter, and many of us remain comic book readers because of the language, the physical, the product, the natural, the material, the medium. And I for one believe that the experience of reading a comic book can be enhanced by understanding how and why the material is done the way in which it is done. And so that from the perspective of an enthusiast, the material that we're going to be talking about in the Paradigm 1 and Paradigm 2, and ultimately Paradigm 0, we'll be covering that in a moment, it will enhance and deepen the experience. And you'll be able to look back at work you've grown up with potentially new eyes and with potential different appreciation. And all of us have our likes and dislikes. We all have our tastes codified when we're 12. They don't call the golden age of comics 12 for nothing. And there are those of us who mature in age and grow out of bad habits and develop habits that are more reflective and less reflexive. You know, and we all grow up. There's that one artist we fucking hate. We just hate his eye or he should die. And there's one artist we love so much. Why doesn't he draw everything? And as you get older and you maintain your interest in the material, should you maintain that interest, you develop a more nuanced understanding of the work and the value of the artist's work on the material. You know, the perfect example of my generation is Mike Sekowsky. Everybody we knew hated Mike Sekowsky. Just like we were 12 years old, and Sekowsky was the antichrist of comic books. He was just, oh my God, he's so dumb. And, you know, 5 years later, you know, I'm 17 years old, I'm looking at the work, and I say, wow, Mike's really changed. He's become a really good... No, he didn't change, I did. And the idea is to grow into an understanding of the material. You know, the archetype of EC Comics, for example, the material I revere enormously. The single most vilified artist at EC Comics is Bernie Krigstein. And Krigstein left comics in a big huff because he felt betrayed by the material and by the work. And he died denying he was ever involved in it. And anecdotally, a friend of mine told me sometime back that he was at a restaurant and he ran into his widow, his ex-wife, and told her that her late husband had become a paragon, an incredibly vital archetype in the American comic book business. And this woman was stunned because of her husband's dismissal and dismay at the way the comic book business had treated him from a perspective of the fan. It's important, I think, for fans to get past prejudices and see material through eyes that don't have anything to do with the content and everything to do with the form. And because the form is incredibly valid. It's an understanding of that form, I believe, as I said earlier, enhances the appreciation of the content.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying not to give away too much of your paradigm that comes up next
week. And you're egging me on, so cut it out, man.
I know. I've done several of your paradigms. So I want to ask one thing, because it's always something I take away from the paradigm, and it's worth buying a ticket and sitting in on one of your seminars, just to hear kind of your opinion on things, the simplest things like word balloons and panel borders. Can you talk just a little bit, without giving too much away, about things like the importance of panel borders and what makes, an effective page layout with separation and panel size, that sort of thing?
Well, as I said, lettering must not be regarded as simply a delivery system for text. It's not just columns of text. It has its own character. It has its own three-dimensional value. And balloons themselves, captions themselves, should not, and panel borders, just the objectifying the panel border should be something avoided, because it's it takes you the reader out of the material. That the balloon and the panel border and captions can be used to create and enhance the illusion of three-dimensional space. There's too much of an assumption in the show business that comic books are storyboards for movies. They're really not. Comic books have as much in common with musical comedy on the stage as they do with television or movies. The melodrama of footlighting is something that has to be dealt with dramatically. But I always feel that the use of, there has to be space and white space between panel borders, because white means the representation of nothing and black is the presence of everything. And by that white space gives you, the reader, an opportunity to breathe between moments. It also creates a more dramatic experience in relationship from one panel to another, which of course is obviated by the use of an inset, but that's another story entirely, and we'll get into that when we do Paradigm 2.
Nice. Well, guys, if you want to hear more about this, you got to go to Talent Talk Live and pick up a ticket. Howard's doing a full seminar live and in person, well, virtually in person on Tuesday, January 12th. Howard, I want to thank you for being here.
The reality is, this is not going to be simply cut and dry bullshit. It's going to be fun, because as Chuck will tell you, I'm riotously funny and brutally clever. And there are those who have Tourette's. I have Tourette's, so my filter is, generally speaking, non-existent. So I can guarantee you education and fun. No more needs to be asked, right? Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you for that wonderful promo video clip right there. That was fantastic. Well, Howard, thanks so much, and I can attest, these are a lot of fun. Your audience gets bigger every single time we do it, and it's very interactive. There's a lot of Q&A going on at the end. You never hold back in any way.
Oh, look, I mean, like they used to be the ad for Lincoln Continental used to be, ask the man who owns one. Find someone who's seen this done this thing before, and he'll tell you. We have a great time. I'm appalling. I'm occasionally offensive. I'm frequently rude. But I'm great company. I'm the kind of guy you'd want to get fucked up in a bar with, because I'd run away and you'd get into a fight. That's the way it is.
I second that 1,000%. Well, Howard, thanks a lot for taking this time to chat with us. Really looking forward to your next Paradigm over Talent Talk.
And I'm delighted that you're freezing your ass off where you are and I'm not. So hey,
it's not pretty here in Chicago. So enjoy sunny West Coast.
I'm 5 doors down from the water and the beach. All I know is I want to die before the tsunami hits. That's my deal.
Well,
all right, man.
Good luck with that. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, man.
Bye.
Be well.